You've sent the message, you've watched the delivered notifications sit there, you've seen the read receipt appear, and then nothing. Silence. And in that silence, something happens inside you that you didn't expect. You start obsessing. You start spiraling. You start wondering what you did wrong, what it means, whether you should send another message or just pretend the first one never happened. That feeling, that uncomfortable, consuming psychological loop, is not an accident. It is not a coincidence. It is the direct result of one of the most powerful and least talked about forces in modern human psychology. Today, we are pulling back the curtain on the dark psychology behind ignoring texts, and what you discover might permanently change the way you see every relationship in your life. Before we go any further, understand this. Not everyone who ignores a text is playing a game. Sometimes people are busy, overwhelmed, or dealing with things you cannot see. But there is a significant portion of text-ignoring behavior that is deeply psychological, either consciously strategic or the product of unconscious emotional patterns. And understanding both sides is what gives you real power. The human brain is wired for social connection at a biological level. When you send a message to another person, you are extending a piece of yourself, your thoughts, your energy, your desire to connect. That act of extending yourself creates an open loop in your nervous system. Your brain expects a response to close that loop. When the response doesn't come, the brain doesn't simply move on. It fixates. This fixation has a name in behavioral psychology. It is called the Zeigarnik effect. Named after Soviet psychologist Bluma Zeigarnik, it describes the brain's powerful tendency to remember and dwell on incomplete tasks far more intensely than completed ones. An unanswered text is the social equivalent of an unfinished task. Your mind keeps returning to it automatically, almost compulsively, searching for resolution. Here is where the dark psychology begins. Some people, consciously or unconsciously, understand this effect and use it. When they withhold a response, they are not simply being unavailable. They are hijacking your brain's natural wiring. They are turning themselves into an open loop that your mind cannot stop running in the background. They become impossible to stop thinking about, not because of who they are, but because of what they withheld. To understand why ignoring texts creates such a powerful psychological pull, you need to understand variable reinforcement, one of the most potent behavioral mechanisms ever studied. B.F. Skinner, the father of behavioral psychology, demonstrated in his landmark research that unpredictable rewards create far stronger behavioral patterns than consistent, predictable ones. Think about slot machines. People do not become addicted to them because they always pay out. They become addicted precisely because the payout is random and unpredictable. The uncertainty is what creates the compulsion. The same neurological mechanism is activated when someone responds to your texts inconsistently, sometimes immediately, sometimes hours later, sometimes not at all. When someone ignores your texts sometimes but responds enthusiastically other times, your brain enters the same state as a gambler at a slot machine. Every time your phone buzzes, there is a rush of dopamine, the anticipation of a possible reward. The unpredictability doesn't reduce your engagement with that person. It amplifies it. You check your phone more. You think about them more. You become more invested, not less. This is the dark core of text-ignoring psychology. Whether the person doing it knows what they are doing or not, the effect is the same. You become neurologically hooked. Your dopamine system is engaged in a loop that is genuinely difficult to break, not because the relationship is deep, but because the reinforcement pattern is powerful. There is another layer to this phenomenon that goes even deeper than behavioral conditioning. It touches the most primal of all human psychological drives, the need for significance. When someone ignores your text, the immediate emotional experience is not just frustration. It is a threat to your sense of self-worth. Your brain interprets social exclusion and rejection through the same neural pathways that process physical pain. This was confirmed by neuroscientist Naomi Eisenberger in her groundbreaking research at UCLA. Being left on red doesn't just feel bad emotionally, it activates the brain's pain centers in the same way a physical wound does. This is not metaphor. This is neuroscience. And when something causes us pain, we become focused on it. We think about it. We analyze it. We replay the conversation, looking for what we might have done wrong. We craft follow-up messages in our heads and then delete them. We reach out to friends asking what they think it means. The person who ignored the text has now consumed hours of your mental bandwidth, all by doing nothing. Now let's talk about the people who do this deliberately. Because they exist, and understanding their psychology is critical. There is a psychological archetype known in clinical literature as the highly avoidant individual. People with avoidant attachment styles, often shaped by early experiences of emotional inconsistency or unavailability, tend to regulate intimacy by controlling access. For an avoidantly attached person, ignoring texts is not always a power move in a calculated sense. It is often an unconscious defense mechanism. When emotional closeness feels threatening, withdrawal becomes the instinctive response. The ignored text is not always about you. It is about their internal regulation of emotional distance. But then there are people who use text ignoring as a fully conscious tool of social dominance. These individuals understand that withholding response creates desire. They have learned, through experience, through trial and error, or through deliberate study of influence, that the person who appears less invested holds more social power in a dynamic. This is sometimes called the principle of least interest, a concept in social psychology that states the person who cares less about the continuation of a relationship has greater power within it. By ignoring your text, the other person is performing their indifference, and that performance, real or staged, shifts the emotional balance of power dramatically. What makes this particularly dark is that the person being ignored often responds by doing exactly the wrong thing. The natural human response to feeling rejected or deprioritized is to pursue more, to send a follow-up message, to double text, to try to re-engage with increasing urgency. But this pursuit only confirms the power dynamic and deepens the psychological hold. Every follow-up message sent from a place of anxiety communicates need. And the communication of need, in the context of someone who is deliberately withholding, only increases their sense of power and control over the dynamic. The cycle becomes self-reinforcing. The more you reach out, the more power they accumulate, and the more they can afford to ignore you. Understanding this cycle intellectually is not enough to break it emotionally, and that gap between knowing and feeling is itself a psychological phenomenon. The brain's emotional processing centers and its rational reasoning centers operate on different timescales. You can know that someone is using psychological leverage against you while simultaneously being unable to stop yourself from reaching for your phone. There is also a gender and social dynamics layer to how text ignoring is perceived and deployed. Research consistently shows that women and men interpret periods of silence differently, with cultural scripts playing a major role in shaping what silence is believed to communicate. In many romantic contexts, the person who responds quickly is subtly perceived as more interested, and interest, when expressed too freely, is paradoxically read as lower value. This creates a cultural environment where many people, particularly in early romantic dynamics, feel compelled to manage their response time deliberately. Not out of cruelty, but but out of a learned social script that says too much eagerness signals low status. The dark psychology here is not personal. It is systemic, built into the invisible rulebook that modern dating and social hierarchies have created. Social media and the visibility of read receipts has intensified all of this enormously. In a world where you can see exactly when someone read your message, the unanswered text becomes a public-facing statement. The reader has actively chosen, in a visible way, not to respond. That visibility transforms a simple delay into a legible social act. And that act carries psychological weight far beyond anything a pre-smartphone generation would recognize. Let's turn now to what text ignoring reveals about the person doing it, because this is where the real insight lives. When someone consistently ignores your messages, they are communicating something, whether they intend to or not. They are revealing their communication style, their emotional availability, and their capacity for the kind of mutual respect that healthy relationships require. Someone who uses silence as a weapon, who withholds response to punish, to gain leverage, or to manufacture desire, is showing you a fundamental truth about how they handle intimacy. They are showing you that when conflict or discomfort arises, their instinct is to disappear rather than engage. That pattern does not improve over time. It intensifies. Someone who ignores texts unconsciously, out of avoidance, overwhelm, or disorganized attachment, is also showing you something important. They are showing you that emotional communication is not currently a strength, and that the relationship would require enormous patience and clear boundary setting to function at a healthy level. In both cases, the ignored text is not primarily about you. It is a window into the interior world of the person on the other side of the screen. Learning to read that window clearly, without taking it entirely personally, without projecting, without catastrophizing, is one of the most emotionally intelligent skills a person can develop. There is also a deeply important distinction between silence as communication and silence as strategy. Silence as communication is natural and human. There are moments when we need space, when we are processing, when we simply do not have the bandwidth to respond. Silence in these moments is not a weapon. It is a human limit. Silence as strategy is something entirely different. It is the deliberate withholding of response with the intention, conscious or unconscious, of producing a specific emotional effect in the other person. It is the use of absence as leverage, and recognizing the difference between these two kinds of silence is crucial to understanding the psychological landscape of your relationships. The way to tell them apart is often found in the pattern rather than the single instance. One ignored text could be anything. A consistent pattern of ignoring messages during emotionally significant moments, after a vulnerable conversation, after a disagreement, after you have expressed a need, is almost never innocent. It is almost always a form of emotional regulation that comes at your expense. Now let's talk about the psychology of the person being ignored, because there is important self-knowledge to excavate here. The intensity of your reaction to an ignored text is deeply revealing. If a delayed response sends you into a spiral of anxiety and self-questioning, that intensity is worth examining. For many people, the disproportionate distress triggered by an unanswered message is rooted in early attachment experiences. If you grew up in an environment where love and attention were inconsistent, where caregivers were sometimes warm and available, sometimes withdrawn and absent, your nervous system learned to treat inconsistency as a crisis signal. An ignored text can unconsciously reactivate those early experiences. This is not a flaw or a weakness. It is the predictable result of a nervous system that learned to survive under specific conditions. But recognizing it is the first step to developing a different response, one rooted in your present reality rather than your past programming. The antidote to the dark psychology of ignored texts is not indifference. It is security. Psychological security is the internal state in which your sense of worth is not contingent on the response of any single person. It is the condition in which a delayed text is simply a delayed text, not a verdict on your value. Building that security is the work of a lifetime, but it is accelerated by one practice above all others: diversifying your emotional investment. When one relationship represents the majority of your social and emotional fulfillment, every signal from that relationship carries enormous weight. The ignored text feels catastrophic because the stakes are existentially high. When you build a rich, full social world, multiple meaningful connections, deep personal interests, a relationship with yourself that is fulfilling, the ignored text loses its power. Not because you care less about people, but because your sense of self is no longer hostage to any single person's behavior. That shift is not just psychologically healthy, it is the most effective counter to anyone attempting to use text ignoring as a form of manipulation. Here is something that is almost never discussed in conversations about text psychology. Sometimes the most powerful response to being ignored is to genuinely stop caring and mean it. Not to perform indifference, not to play a game in return, but to actually redirect your energy, your attention, and your emotional investment somewhere else. This is not giving up on people. This is the exercise of a deep and undervalued form of self-respect. When you are able to release your grip on someone else's response and return your focus to your own life, something interesting happens. The psychological dynamic shifts, not as a tactic, but as a genuine consequence of your changed emotional state. People sense real detachment in a way they cannot sense performed detachment. When you genuinely stop waiting, when you genuinely move on, the energy of the interaction changes. This is not manipulation. It is authenticity. And authentic emotional freedom is more attractive, more compelling, and more powerful than any calculated social strategy will ever be. The dark psychology behind ignoring texts ultimately reveals something profound about the fragility and the resilience of human connection in the digital age. We have built a world where a tiny glowing screen mediates our most intimate experiences of belonging and rejection. We have made our nervous systems available to each other in real time, with full visibility, and we have not yet developed the emotional tools to navigate that visibility with wisdom. The person ignoring your text is navigating their own fear, their own defense mechanisms, their own complicated relationship with intimacy and vulnerability. That does not excuse behavior that is deliberately hurtful, but it does contextualize it in a way that removes you from the center of a story that was never entirely about you. Understanding the psychology of ignored texts is not about winning a social game. It is about seeing clearly, seeing yourself, seeing others, seeing the invisible forces that shape the most mundane and the most painful moments of modern connection. That clarity is its own kind of power. It is the power that comes not from controlling others, but from no longer being controlled by them. If this gave you a new way of seeing something you've experienced, share it with someone who needs to hear it today. Subscribe for more deep dives into the psychology of human behavior, relationships, and the invisible forces shaping your inner world. And remember, the most powerful thing you can do when someone goes silent is refuse to let their silence define your worth. See you in the next one.